CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. To learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Hi everybody, my name's Paul Magee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research here at the University of Canberra. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking here on unceded Ngunnawal country and to pay my respects to all First Nations people, past and present, and in particular, any First Nations people here today. Now, as I hope you know, Kabir Mokamel, who was our advertised speaker, cannot make it today due to difficult conditions in Afghanistan where he was going to present from. So I've stepped in with a paper that I happen to have in my top drawer, and this is actually fresh. It was written for a context. I delivered it on Friday, but this is actually a still modified version of it because I would really like your feedback on it. It's on its way, I hope, to publication. Okay. So it's called Problems with the Concept of Belonging. In 1969, artist Pseudo Mireles made the work Mutação Geográficas, Fronteira Rio-São Paulo, Geographical Mutations, Border, Rio, São Paulo. Brazil was under military dictatorship at the time. The work involved the artist standing on one side of the border, distinguishing the two states of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. Mireles had with him a square leather case, 2 feet high and wide, the kind that would be used to transport official documents. An internal divider separated it diagonally into 2 halves, each of which had a smaller pocket, divided off from its surrounds. Standing there at the border, Mireles dug a hole in the ground. He proceeded to fill one side of the case with the materials he had just dug up. The artist then stepped across the border, suitcase in tow. He dug a hole there too, filling the opposite side of the case with the contents of that hole. He did the same with the smaller pockets, only in reverse, so that the compartment containing the dirt of Rio de Janeiro state would also have a São Paulo component, and vice versa. Now, this case, mingling both states, was then exhibited in a gallery in São Paulo City. How are we to make sense of this strange work? Mireles described it and the larger physical art, Arte Física, series of which it formed a part as, quote, an attempt at reducing something to its abstraction. One way to understand the abstraction which this work reduces national borders to would be to consider Benedict Anderson's observation that older European versions of sovereignty imagined power proceeding hierarchically from a central dynastic core, becoming ever hazier at distances and overlapping at the margins of sovereignty. Anderson compares the modern nation state with its vision of horizontal and fundamentally anonymous kinship, and its accompanying geographical sense that, quote, sovereignty is fully, flatly and evenly operative over each square centimetre of a legally demarcated territory. The abstraction Mireles' artwork makes of this new reality would be something like the following. The modern nation state imagines its 250-year-old social categories are so natural that they inhere in the very dirt. Go back. Mireles' work reduces the mingled states or the mingled soils of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo to the abstract categories of the nation state, revealed as fanciful in the process. But there is a reverse move here too. The dirt, plant matter, and so forth contained in the case do not turn into mere information in the process of this abstracting. To the contrary, the case's material contents start to take on their own strange presence, as you realise the more you look at the documentation of the work. So for that matter, does the leather, or rather animal skin, lining of the case containing said dirts. There is a kind of symbolic intervention that involves taking what seems obvious and even undeniable about a place. I'm delivering this paper in Canberra, for instance, and unsettling it. We come to realise that there was a story or proposition, an abstraction, Mary Liz would say, underlying that commonplace. In the process, the material substrate of the place comes to the fore as something fragile. The clumps of dirt in Mary Liz's document case start to demand our attention in a way they would never have done while they're in the ground at the border. A fragility ensues. We can easily imagine a reenactment, an Australian reenactment of Mary Liz's work, say on the border of the states of Victoria and New South Wales. But here there's an interesting additional factor, I think. People may well find something absurd in the idea that the dirt itself is still the state of Victoria, or conversely, that of New South Wales, once stored in a document case like this and removed to an art gallery in the Parliamentary Triangle. I think an increasingly broader section of the Australian population could, however, imagine that the soils extracted in this way were nonetheless still Wiradjuri. One might even on such grounds beseech the artist to put them back. So far, we've addressed operations that affect the borders in a national landscape and the colonial fantasies of a timeless white presence that comes to the fore when you reduce such boundary zones to the abstract concepts they signify. The gamble of the paper to follow is that we can perform a similar kind of operation, reducing things to their abstraction, on the words we use to convey our relationship to such spaces. In the English language, one of the most powerful ways to speak about relations to place is through the verb belong. To belong, in its various forms, I belong, you belong, it belongs to me, is one of the 2,000 most common words in printed English. The noun deriving from it, belonging, is also highly common. Both quite strange, as our words go. The English word belonging raises intriguing questions, Africanist Peter Gashira notes. Quoting Gashira, why has it such a strong emotional appeal? And why is it quite difficult to translate into many other languages? For instance, French and German equivalents are flat and lack the emotional, nostalgic ring that makes the English word such a powerful slogan, not only in Africa and not only among Anglophones, but in the rest of the world as well. Gashira's reference to belonging's function as a, quote, powerful slogan is telling. He proceeds to observe that the recent intensification in the word's usage in African contexts has accompanied a, quote, explosion of fierce conflicts, unquote, over group-based rights to land ownership and residence. This paper will suggest that the reason words like belong and belonging have such affinity for channeling emotion and exclusion is that they have about them a strong, but also ultimately abstract sense of being grounded in the soil. The words belong and belonging can be used in manifold ways, including many positive and productive ones. I'm certainly not trying in what follows to suggest that the words are pernicious each and every time they are used. But there is a reason the word belonging appears in Pauline Hanson's 2016 maiden Senate speech. Hanson refers to the feelings that have always taken her on seeing the Australian flag raised. Quote, it is about belonging, respect, and commitment to fight for Australia. This will never be traded or given up for the mantras of diversity or tolerance. Australia had a national identity before federation, and it had nothing to do with diversity and everything to do with belonging. Birch references this kind of usage in a trenchant 1992 article. In it, Birch hones in on the furore that erupted at initial attempts to rename the mountain range that explorer and murderer Thomas Mitchell called the Grampians, in homage to a mountain range in his native Scotland. They are now known once more by their Koori name, Garryword, as part of their official dual name, Garryword Grampians National Park. But the path to that restoration was long and contentious, eliciting aggrieved and shockingly racist sentiments from a wide stratum of the settler population, as Birch documents through his reading of an archive of letters sent to the relevant minister at the time. Birch comments, "To name spaces is to name histories and also to create them. The process is accepted as natural, representing a given that this country belongs to and is a white Australia. But this sense of security evaporates when the hidden history of colonial domination and Indigenous subordination is challenged by an attempt to alter the names of spaces." I think what Birch is pointing up here in this curious two-verb phrase, belongs to and is a white Australia, is the strange complicity whereby the settler's word for making claims on a place is also the word they use for indicating membership of a species or genus. The OED, Oxford English Dictionary, cites an example of the taxonomic usage from the 28-volume Flora of North America. Quote, "Another species traditionally classified in Melicotheria belongs with Byrom in Biracia." Unquote. The doubling up of biological, that individual belongs in this classificatory field, and proprietary, that space belongs to this individual, the doubling up of those meanings in one and the same word explains something of the mythic power of either usage, which will tend to attract vague connotations of the other. The settlers' conviction that they belong here, whether through the immemorial feel of the names they have given this place, the Grampians, or however else that belonging is invoked, is, I'm suggesting, never far from the fantasy that this place belongs to them. Floating around both these uses, I would further suggest, is a third meaning of the word belong, the Hansonite one, to do with judging people's worth by the degree of their social acceptance. What better phrase could Birch alight upon than belongs to and is a white Australia to convey from the inside the settler's delusion that the land is theirs by natural right, and if not by natural right, at least by domination. As noted, belong, belonging, and belongs to also have very positive uses, including among Indigenous communities looking to characterise their own relationship to country and community. But I'm wary of these words when they are used by non-Indigenous groups in settler colonies like Australia. Which is why I propose to perform a Muralies-like critical act upon belong, belongs to, and belonging now, paring back the complex and compounding meanings of these terms to the point that we see nothing other than the propositions embedded in their texture as part of a class of words that look and sound the same way. My argument will be the following. In English, words with hard to grasp but clearly Germanic roots signify earthiness and bodily immediacy. English is part of the Germanic language family, including Dutch, German, Frisian, Icelandic, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish. You can hear the German word und in our word and, die in our word the, and Buch in our word book. Apparently, that word book, just like book, apparently they initially come from an ancestor of our word beech, as in beech tree. So this proto-Germanic word for beech tree is the distant ancestor of book. And it has something to do with the surfaces on which runes would be scratched. At any rate, that's where English starts off, as a Germanic tongue, but it changes. The greater part of the language's complex noun and verb endings were simplified, i.e. knocked out, due to English's role as a contact language, a Creole basically, during the Viking invasions. From the period of the Norman conquest in 1066, English took into its newly simplified grammatical order a vast quantity of words from French and from French's parent tongue, Latin. Initially, this reflected the fact that under the French overlords, administrative, legal, commercial, educational, intellectual, and ecclesiastical exchanges were all conducted in those two languages. Even after the official use of French declined in the early 15th century, borrowings from it, and even more so from Latin, continued apace right up to the 18th century, a function of those two languages' ongoing centrality to cultural, diplomatic, and scientific power in and outside the British Isles. And the upshot of this is that we speak a lot of French and Latin when we speak English, particularly in universities. A quick way to illustrate this is to hover over one of the sentences you've just heard. So I've bolded all words that have ultimately come into English through French or Latin, almost all of these after 1066. You should be able to hear in contrast the Germanic sounds in words like this, thee, that, under, overlord, were, all, in, those. The Germanic side of the language has been reduced in this sentence, as in so many intellectual sentences, to the functional task of connecting conceptual terms borrowed from French and Latin, or via Latin from Greek, like the word ecclesiastical. But such examples should not blind us to the fact that the English language is suffused with Germanic verbs, nouns, and adjectives as well. You see this the moment you shift register and talk about something apparently closer to the ground. Here's the 20th century poet Ted Hughes, out there on the heath, invoking the elements. Over the stone rushes the wind, able to mingle with nothing, like the hearing of the blind stone itself. Drinking the sea and eating the rock, a tree struggles to make leaves. So in this case, every single word, with the possible exception of rushes and the definite exception of able, every single word here is Germanic, has Germanic origins. And I think you'll probably agree that the feel is instantly more earthy. Earthy itself is a word with deep Germanic roots. And compare the effect if instead of the feel is instantly more earthy, I had said the sensibility is instantly more terrestrial. In an essay on Ted, he notes the role a predominantly Germanic vocabulary plays in Hughes's verse, with its, quote, attempts to make vocal the inner life, the being-thereness of sea, stone, wind, and tree. For Hughes's repeated recourse to Germanic words like these taps into language's power as, quote, etymological occurrence, a symptom of human history, memory, and attachments. The power of speaking German and English is something poets have long understood, if only intuitively. If you want to get a feeling of immediate bodily experience into your line, cut the Latinate word and go for the Germanic. Interesting that at least part of the emotional appeal of utterances like I belong, you belong, it belongs to me, can be reduced to the historical fact that English has these two key strata in its lexicon by dint of invasion and the ethnic/class domination that followed. It is what makes Latinate words in English feel objective, in the sense of scientifically or bureaucratically powerful, but also somewhat clinical. Whereas Germanic words can feel they belong to the workers, the passions, or even the elements themselves. The abstraction at the core of the strong emotional appeal of our belong words is, in short, that in English, Germanic words connote the bodily and grounded. The word belong does not just mean pertain to. It seems, in addition, to perform the very thing it's talking about, an attachment beyond precise reasons. Emote here. But this is not the only abstraction we might rescue and clinically isolate within the emotive operations of the word to belong, belongs to, and belonging. Not only are these words packed with the feelings of immediacy and earthiness that Germanic vocabulary conventionally bears in English, they're at the same time quite opaque as vehicles for the various meanings we've seen them convey: taxonomic membership, property ownership, social acceptance. So that's to say that belong is an instance of semantic opacity. This is a term from linguistics, semantic opacity, and specifically from the study of words. It's when you can't see from just looking at or hearing a word, when you can't see where its meaning's coming from, that's a case of semantic opacity. I'll give you a way into this by showing you a word that is semantically transparent. So if I give you a word like un-Australia, you mightn't have heard that before, you mightn't know what it means, but nonetheless, there's elements of semantic transparency about it because you know what un means. You know that it negates whatever follows, and you'll have a range of meanings for Australia. Some of that word you could break down further too, perhaps. But the point is that you can see just from looking at the word where some of its meaning is coming from. And in actual fact, any example of new poetic diction has to have a strong element of semantic transparency about it, or it simply won't work. People won't understand it. However, when you get to a word like belong, as in therein belongs to, well, the to will be transparent. You'll have a meaning for that. And the S on the end of belongs, that'll indicate third person singular. But the chunk that is belong itself looks kind of inscrutable. It's very hard to work out from that chunk of sounds what meanings are making it up. There are persistent folk etymologies that suggest that the be part of belong is somehow derived from the verb to be. It's not the case at all. Actually, in Old English, that be prefix meant at, about, or near. So you've got this slew of locational adverbs and prepositions, many of them still current in English today, like behind, below, beneath, between, beyond. The be at the start there was this Old English prefix meaning at or about. You also have benorth and besouth. They're obsolete now, but they're lovely words. Um, and the point is that in the Middle Ages, those words were semantically transparent. It was clear what the be meant at the start. Everybody knew that. We stopped using that be prefix to form new words a very long time ago, and we stopped understanding it as an independent element of meaning soon after. Sure. As far as that belong aspect of words like belonging or belongs to, or such phrases, as far as it goes, I think it's fair to say that to most speakers, that chunk of sound seems to have acquired its various meanings, echoes, and connotations through the dim recesses of time as quasi-natural properties. In sum, the Germanic etymological resonances, which in contemporary English signify what is grounded and bodily, and the fundamentally obscure relation between belongs component elements, make belong, belongs to, and belonging fine vehicles for the naturalisation of a given agent's hold on a place as something swathed in the mists of time, to do with emotion and the familiarities of habit and place, that which, quote, belongs to and is. This paper has so far addressed national landscapes that fit in suitcases and belongings that might say more about English speakers' relation to their own language than to place itself. There's more to say about belong, belongs to, and belonging, including whether the last of these words merits its frequent identification as a universal desideratum of the human species or not. But first, compare the material tabled above with the very different attitude to place that emerges in a speech that Nyimpa man Bradley Hardy delivered just near to the 30,000-year-old fish traps that bejewel the outback New South Wales town of Brewarrina. Jane Crawford was there at the time. Bradley is chairman of the Brewarrina Aboriginal Cultural Museum. This is what he told us. The river, in the old time of our ancestors, was the community that brought community together. Now, when that happened here, 8 different tribes who spoke 8 different languages built the fish traps. And our place, in the time of our ancestors, became even more and more of a meeting place. It became a gathering and a sharing place. The river, in the old time of our ancestors, was the community that brought community together. It's a stunning phrase. It's neither about belonging nor not about belonging. It characterises the relationship to country differently. Let this be the centre of my paper. In a much cited article from 2010 entitled Searching for Belonging, an Analytical Framework, Marko Antoncic notes the sense of self-evidence that attaches to words like belong and belonging. The article opens with the mention of a young British Muslim man who, in a BBC4 documentary on the British mosque, quote, justified the need to have mosques in Britain by simply affirming, I belong here. Antoncic comments, quote, in its simplicity, this sentence might have passed unnoticed. The notion of belonging is indeed so intuitive and commonsensic that people generally would not bother asking their interlocutor, what do you mean that you belong here? Leaving hanging the question as to why British Muslims in particular would be called upon to justify their architectural heritage, Antoncic proceeds to suggest that the, quote, intuitive and commonsensic status of the concept of belonging pertains to its academic deployment as well. The word belonging, he notes, is regularly treated as a, quote, self-explanatory term and therefore left undefined, unquote, by geographers, cultural theorists, and sociologists. Even as other scholars have attempted to nuance our understanding of it, through reference, for instance, to the empirical variety of modes of belonging, belonging, quoting Antoncic, remains a term vaguely defined and under-theorised. The analysis of just what belonging entails that Antoncic proceeds to supply is illuminating and has been widely cited. For him, the concept demarcates a meeting point between one's sense of, quote, place belongingness, which is his coinage, and the regularly exclusionary, quote, politics of belonging. But it's worth pointing out, for all the cogency of Antoncic's solution, that an opening reference to the vagueness of a term is a common move in research on belonging. Psychologist Kellyanne Allen and her colleagues open their article, Belonging, a Review of Conceptual Issues, an Integrated Framework and Directions for Future Research, with the claim, quote, there's general agreement that belonging is a fundamental human need that all people seek to satisfy. And there are 4 citations backing up that assertion, including one to the works of that rather dubious character, the eugenicist Abraham Maslow, with his hierarchy of needs, which include love and belonging. I could say more about Maslow. He at one point suggested it would be a good idea to euthanize all of India. Really despicable character, but nonetheless quoted to back up the idea that belonging is a fundamental human need. The authors immediately add, quote, however, there is less agreement about the belonging construct itself, how belonging should be measured, and what people can do to satisfy their need for belonging. In like fashion, geographer Hessam Mohseni and his colleagues follow their opening assertion as to belonging's intrinsic relation to human nature, with reference to the opacity of the term. Quote, however, belonging is a complex, multifaceted phenomenon that challenges its understanding and evaluation. Both these articles, like Antoncic's, comprise large reviews of the literature. In each case, the outcome is a clarification as to how belonging and related terms are being used as concepts by researchers and how they might be better operationalised in the future. The argument we do not see rehearsed in these three papers is that vagueness, far from being an obstacle to its better functioning, might be a constitutive factor in belonging's success as a theoretical term, the very reason studies keep being required to better define it. At the very least, one might wonder about a theoretical term that cannot be adequately translated into even closely related languages like French or German. We've seen anthropologist Peter Gashira's comments on this score, and Tonsich mentions the untranslatability of belonging as well. Now, in the extended version of this paper, I reflect on this untranslatability, and I ask what it means for a supposedly universal human need like belonging to actually be untranslatable from English. Doesn't that suggest limits to its universality? And in this longer treatment, I suggest that the answer to the question of whether belonging is universal or not, well, a good way to approach it is to reflect on why the term is so apparently untranslatable. Two factors come immediately to mind. First, for me, is the fact that it has an inherent vagueness due to the fact that the verbal uses it indexes, those belong words, stand for such a range of things in different contexts, from taxonomic membership, the right of property, or the right to property, social acceptance, not to mention correctness. So there's all these meanings that those belong words, those verbs, can have attached to them, depending on the context. At the same time, belonging as a concept term, as a scientific term, gains a sense of immediacy and self-evidence due to those Germanic roots discussed above. In a way, it functions as a kind of emoticon. So with this word belonging, we've got both vagueness and precision in multiple different directions. So of course it's untranslatable. What other word in another tongue will combine all these features, which themselves are products of a very long and highly specific history? We might also ask what other word will allow the theorist using it such creative license to bring forth whichever of these alternately vague and precise meanings they choose. For the upshot of these facts is that we can make the technical term belonging have a meaning and nuance totally distinct to those provided by the next analyst, and both will be more or less convincing, which gives room for yet more papers on the topic of what belonging truly means. It's all to do with how you deploy this combination of precision and vagueness. In short, when it comes to belonging, the theorist's definitional act is an inherently creative act. That's what I would say for the concept's purported universality. Unfortunately, for all the admirable value of projects like Antonsich, Allen et al. And Mossini et al.'s, there is no shortage of creative voices using belong and belonging as an alibi for their violence. As we've seen Racial Discrimination Act offender Australian Senator Paul Hanson put it with such self-evidence, quote, "It is about belonging." The question this raises for me is whether we really need to keep propping up the idea that there is something universal in Hanson's reference there. In conclusion, I want to take you to one final artwork. Now, this time it's a piece of graffiti scrawled in shouting capital letters on the lintel of an inside wall. And it's part of an exhibition at the Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art. "Prove that you belong," the graffiti puns. Now, the voice evoked here says, these are the words of an anonymous and angry bigot, delivered in sadistic fashion at marginalised community members. By the same token, and this is why the work is appearing in an art gallery, something about the operations of the word belong is being clarified here. pointing towards the reasons it can have such pernicious affordances. Much of this comes down to the use of the word prove in a context that otherwise seems to refer to social acceptance. For in this manner, much in the tenor of Birch's sardonic reference to the fantasy that the mountain range then known as the Grampians, quote, belongs to and is a white Australia. In this way, through this collocation of this scientific term with the idea of belong, meanings of belong that typically seem to operate at arm's length are being shown to work off each other. What we prove with its scientific connotations evokes in this graffiti artwork context are the senses of belong to do with objective category membership. I touched on this briefly above. The OED cites a phrase from a 1996 geometry textbook, quote, "This attribute belongs to all isosceles triangles." Further quotations show that belong conveys species membership as well. As in Charles Lyell's 1833 comment, quote, "None of the associated mammiferous remains belong to a species which now exist." And the sentence from Flora of North America cited earlier. The lack of actual consensus in contemporary biology as to the nature of species membership notwithstanding, these uses are clearly pointing to a sense of belonging to do with matters of fact. We might nuance this point in turn by acknowledging a further dimension to such, at least aspirationally, objective uses. There is an implication, or at least the hint of one, that the classification that the belong verb references in such cases is the rightful or fitting as opposed to a misguided one. So that reference from Flora of North America, closer inspection shows that it's actually correcting an earlier set of judgments. To quote it again, another North American species traditionally classified in Melicotheria belongs with Byram in Byracea. And this corrective usage of belong in these categorical contexts, it seems actually to draw from an earlier and by now, at least on the surface, obsolete use of belong to do with fitting and appropriate conduct. So the OED has a quote from 1602, "To do all offices that belongeth a Christian man to do." So we have some ways of using belong verbs to convey matters of fact, albeit sometimes a little tendentiously. What prove that you belong does is evoke these taxonomic uses and fuse them to that tranche of meanings to do with social acceptance, also mentioned briefly above. Subjective impression is a key feature of these. Quote, "It's crucial for military brats to, quote, face our unrequited need to belong." That's one quotation from the OED's belong entry. "I don't feel like I don't belong," runs another. We are dealing with subjective senses of social membership here. But by the same token, we can detect a clear reference in the word unrequited to the decisive influence of those others who will welcome or reject the one who would belong in this sense. This use of belong has, in short, elements of plebiscite to it, being crucially dependent upon what level of acceptance the subject achieves among others in the group. What the proof that you belong graffiti underlines, I think, with all its blatant sadism, is that marginalised individuals and groups face an inherent deficit whenever belonging becomes the rubric by which they are assessed. The fact that belong also denotes subjective category membership points disturbingly to naturalising trends in these same usages. We still have to bring a third realm of meanings into the picture, something implicit within the four-word graffiti/artwork under consideration. As noted in relation to Birch's sardonic belongs to and is a white Australia, we use belongs to label rightful ownership. The further implication of prove that you belong is that the one who cannot prove that they have widespread community acceptance behind them has no right to treat this place as somewhere that belongs to them. The implication is not there in the words themselves so much as in the Nazi, skinhead, nativist and otherwise supremacist modes of fear-mongering and harassment that this artwork's form as scrawled on a wall graffiti evokes. We have long cited Walter Benjamin's observation that, quote, fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life. It's typically taken to mean that fascisms compete with art for the power of spectacle. What this prove that you belong artwork rather more disturbingly holds up in all its incisive mimesis is the possibility that propagandists like Trump, Farage, Hansen, and in their own idioms, Putin, Orban, Bolsonaro, Milei, they have a highly sophisticated and even at times original ear to the currents in the language. Able, for instance, to steer through the vague and alternately clotted meanings in our belong words to strike exactly and inflame. So I'm saying it's not just the theorists who are creative when it comes to wielding belonging. You know, politicians in particular have mastery here. Reading Benjamin's fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life in the light of that specific sense of aesthetics, representational prowess in the service of moving bodies to act differently, helps us to see that these disgraceful individuals' capacity to at times land words exactly puts them only so far from masters like Hughes and Heaney. Literary critics might have some genuine and precise work to do here, work in the nature of bomb defusal. Thank you. So any comments or questions? Riley?
First of all, thanks for that talk. It was very interesting and got me thinking about a lot of things. My question is about, so your section when you talk about, the linguistic side of things, and you talk about the Germanic roots. I guess I don't know if I just missed it, but in terms of like the reason why those words connect to the more earthy, as you say, types of usage. I guess I was wondering, is it like, are you positing that it's something to do with like the construction of the words themselves or the actual connection to history, or?
It's purely historical. It's a matter of the class that was using them.
Yeah.
So the French overlords brought in all their vocabulary, and then that became the vocabulary for administrative, ecclesiastical, and intellectual functions. Hence all the words that I just used, which are all, you know, Latinate and Francophone. Whereas the general population, you know, stayed speaking English, and that class differentiation, even though it is so long ago, it still remains in the language. And when people, you know, who haven't gone to university, who haven't progressed far in school, when they find words unintelligible, it's often the words that are of that Romance stratum. You know, so yeah, it's totally linked to a history of ethnic and class domination.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But it plays out when you're writing a poem and you want to go for the word that's going to feel like it's really bodily and engaged. Yeah, don't speak Latin. Yeah, if you can. So.
Thanks for that fascinating talk. But to bring the concept of belonging home, so to speak, when I first came to uni from a working class background, blah, 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 but without the same chips on my shoulders as Vance, one of the things I had to do to belong was to speak a different language, to use the Latin French words. So on a very practical level, I was just wondering what the UC does to make new students from traditional working class backgrounds or Indigenous students feel welcome in a different language environment, maybe in your own course. And a more theoretical level, how much this plays out in the debate, the anti-elite debate, particularly in the US, where it's just because you're born there, and these outsiders, even their families have been there a long time, they're outsiders because of that Latin French language.
Yeah. There was actually a book in the 50s by Grove. I forget his first name. It was called The Language Bar. And, you know, it was postulating that, yeah, our vocabulary has this exclusive function. In terms of what's practically done in this institution to thwart it, Reading, I would imagine, you know, it's setting reading and it's conversation. And hopefully people are opening up spaces where they are welcoming people in to a different vocabulary and empowering people with it. I've certainly seen cases where that is absolutely happening here. But yeah, that's probably as much as I could say there.
The anti-intellectual people of the soil.
Yeah, I mean, you can take this sort of analysis too far, and it can end up very reductive because, you know, there's plenty of Latinate words that are saturated in our everyday vocabulary as well. So, you know, and Grove's book is problematic in that regard. It's one of those sort of theories of everything, like humans are defined by the fact they have an opposable thumb, and that's what, you know, has led to the pyramids and so forth. You know, like you don't want to go too far down that line, but nonetheless, belonging really stands out because our conceptual terms, the terms sociologists use, the terms that we use in our book titles and things, are overwhelmingly from that Latinate one. You know, that Latinate strand. And I think something of the kind of dubiousness of belonging as a word is the way it rhetorically plays on some of those kind of etymological imaginings that are packed into the Germanic words. That's certainly not the only problem with it, though, because like thinking is a Germanic word as well. And, you know, thinking's great.
Thanks, Paul. I was interested in the comment about the prefix be passing out of usage at a certain point for words like bejeweled or benighted or stuff like that. And it occurs to me that they endure in dialects, you know, and I'm thinking about the way something my grandmother used to say a lot about her chapel and her village was, "'Tis where we belong to be."
Yeah.
And she brings those two words together, belong to be, and they very much had a sense of, you know, what you were saying about place and categorization, but also duty, you know, to them. So, and I always love that phrase, which is where I belong to be. I use it in my head quite a lot. But thinking more personally about belonging, do you have a sense of belonging? If so, to what or who? Or is this kind of problematic made the concept sort of a no-go area?
I've been working on this material for about 10 years in collaboration with a colleague, Elena Isayev, who you've met. And Elena is actually a classical historian, but she's a historian of travel and mobility in the ancient world. And that leads her to be very suspicious of a lot of contemporary language that we use that we assume is universal. And so Lena and I have been swapping ideas and evidence on this topic for, you know, for a good decade. And in my case, yeah, I think that just came because I was always a bit bugged by these words, by the pernicious uses, obviously. But yeah, something about them just made me a little suspicious. And I want to say not in every usage, just in certain contexts, they seem to have an elective affinity for propaganda. And I wanted to think more about that. And their widespread acceptance in scholarly discourse makes me really, you know, doubly interested. But as for me having a feeling of belonging or not, look, what I'm interested in. So Owen and I teach together often, and one of the creative writing exercises we do is we get students to write down a list of all the words they can think of for a certain entity. Say all the words you can think of for sea, all the words you can think of for mountain, all the words you can think of for, you know, land, desert or whatever. You write down a list of 30 words, you spend 2 minutes on it, and then we say, okay, now write about those things without using any of those words. And it kind of infuriates people, but it's also this fantastic challenge to actually, yeah, to use your brain differently. And I think that's my stance on this stuff. It's a kind of ethical one. It's, yeah, I want to insist that there are other ways we configure relation to place or community. And a lot of them are right around us because there's indigenous languages all around us. You know, at the very least, we should start listening to them, I think, in this country. John, and Jen was...
Thank you, Paul. Fascinating talk. I just wanted to...
Oh, John, you've got the mic?
I do,
cool.
yes. I just wanted to go back to the German, perhaps. So what's the kind of German equivalent, I guess? I mean, I couldn't help but think in the political sense back to what Heidegger used to talk about before the war, and the idea of Heimlich or homely. If you'd excuse my kind of schoolboy understanding of Heidegger, and therefore the opposite of that, which is the unhomely, those who did not have a home and therefore could not be German. So I mean that's a kind of obvious sort of parallel. But is there a kind of similar term in German to belonging?
Look, I would say I would say actually almost a priori there can't be. And the reason is that German has not had the linguistic history that I was tracing, where you have two really clear and apparent, obvious, strands in the received language, where one of them, stands for the much more Heimlich, if you like, kind of uses. So yeah, that for me is part of the argument about the untranslatability of this stuff. That's a very particular and strange history in English. English is such a strange language. But the other thing is that German, again, I know more from a analytical perspective than as a speaker. German is far more transparent than English, so that if you read Paul Celan, you'll see that he's just constantly jamming words together, and it works and it makes sense to German speakers. And so many words, the morphemes, the kind of elements that build them up, are meaningful to the speaker. Whereas French is kind of the opposite extreme of being highly conventionalized. And so again, once we talk in this level, no, there's not equivalence. Other than when you write your scholarly essay on, the true meaning of belonging, and that's where you fantasize that it's this universal term.
Thanks. Yeah. I just wanted to kind of make a slightly bureaucratic note that our regulatory authority TECSA actually measures universities on whether we do a good job of creating a sense of belonging for students. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. They've probably got, Maslow on their, committee. Like,
but actually, if you so it comes through in the Quilt surveys that get sent out to students, and so but actually the measures are kind of a little bit about conviviality, about like whether students feel that they are connecting with other students inside and outside class, and whether they have those opportunities.
Yeah, and look, that could be really important too. Like, I'm trying not to be simplistic and reductive about these things, because obviously there's huge amount of context where these words do really good service. I more just want to sound a warning about the potential dangers of them, and for us to sharpen our eyes as much as possible to how propaganda works, basically. And, apply more literary criticism to those spaces, not just to poems, not just to novels.
Yeah, seems really important to me.
Yeah, thanks.
Kerry's got a question.
Kerry, and Kim's up the back.
This is less a question and more amusing, not amusing. In relation to the artwork, Prove That You Belong, very impactful. People, I don't think anybody could fail to know what the meaning of that artwork was. And it's a combination of visual and the text. And I use text a lot. But I was just wondering, given that the word belong is so English, I wonder what impact that artwork would have if the text was in a different language. Whether the message would be quite so powerful and undeniable.
Yeah, I mean, it'd depend on the language, obviously, but my suspicion would be there's no way it would have the same effect. But also, you know, we don't just have bigots with verbal mastery in English, like I said, Orban or, you know, Millet, or, you know, you can run the gamut, and each language has their own specific resources. Which is why in some ways you need a kind of poetics for this stuff rather than just a checklist of, you know, words to worry about. It's, and I think we need to think of propaganda as a kind of art form, and demagogues not as idiots, you know, except on an ethical and emotional or those other levels, but yeah, people with a disturbing power to wield the, you know, vaguenesses and precisions and emotive powers in the tongue. Javi Kim had a question.
So how does it sit with you when First Nations people and others say that we belong to country, whether it be river, mountains, or the ecosphere and cosmos? Does that have a certain baggage that bugs you a bit, or you find risky? And I just another quick one. Do you know what happened to the graffiti "Prove that you belong"? I'd be tempted to just leave it there if I was a curator, because I thought it was quite artistic. I thought that was actually artwork at the start. And I link it to sort of Owen's point that I wonder if it could be appropriated as belong to be, because it's like love as a verb, that everyone should prove that they belong, and maybe we get some value out of that as individuals and as communities.
Yeah, look, Kim, that is great. That it is an artwork, but I'm really glad that it wasn't, you know, that it was in that space in between whether you think it's an artwork or someone who's vandalized the gallery. You know, that to me gets at the power of whatever that artist has done. But it's now ephemera. You can't find that on the web anymore. And I've tried to contact the people to attribute it. I can't work out who the artist was either from looking over catalogues. But yeah, there's the power. With regard to Indigenous uses, yeah, I'd have a lot of respect for them. And I think in some ways it's where a lot of the meanings in these words really do in some ways work, you know? I find them far more convincing as uses. And also, I don't want to tell people how to speak too, you know, like, but I am very suspicious when non-Indigenous people use them in this country. And that's what I said in that earlier, you know, early in the paper. That's where I would stand on that. And also, I guess, given, you know, the histories in this place, it is pretty astounding that Senator Hanson wants to help herself to words like these when there is, you know, just such palpable evidence of not having the right to be there, you know, or here on Ngunnawal country, uninvited, like, but she wants to use these belong words. Like, I find that, you know, deeply ironic and disturbing.
It's sort of just a thought that I had running, but I feel like a lot of discussion, like in the questions and in your responses, kind of linked to it. I like wrote it down as you were talking. I wonder, in terms of the actual specific phrasing of belonging in English, you know, we have sort of different ways that could it be used, but, you know, that specifically that, you know, ownership. And I wonder whether maybe one of the reasons why it is untranslatable is because perhaps like the different kinds of way to belong, you know, that sense of community kind of thing, maybe in the word belonging, it's inseparable from the ownership. Maybe there's some sort of like with the word itself. So it's sort of like there's no way to use it without. And like even when you were talking about, do you feel like you belong to somewhere and you like, you know, well, like, you know, I mean, rejecting that idea of like ownership, to me, it kind of makes sense, right? Like,
yeah, and I think this is one of the key untranslatabilities. Like I have been asking various people who are, you know, fluent speakers of other languages, like how satisfactorily can you translate this word? And it seems the shared semantic space in the English one, not shared semantic space, the two meanings of acceptance and property ownership don't seem to go together in other languages, you know, with the potential translations of a verb like I belong. And, you know, it belongs to me. Like that kind of crossover doesn't seem to happen, at least in any other language I've been able to find out about. You know, you'll definitely be able to translate those individual meanings relatively satisfactorily, but not the two, you know, where the same word is used for the two, or albeit through a different syntax. That seems to be really peculiar again, and part of the innate affordances within this vocabulary for pernicious purposes, I would say, or the occasionally, you know, really valid one, like in the Indigenous case, where belonging and some sense of belonging to kind of makes sense. They maybe not, you know, not as well as one would like. Like, I think I'd prefer to know, I guess I'd say that too, Kim, you know, I'd prefer to know what word you would use in Ngunnawal or Barkindji, or, you know, and how that might bring life into English if we try and find equivalents in English for that.
And, you know, thinking around those questions of ownership, that part of the sort of odd mobility in these uses is around the kind of sometimes covert flipping of the subject and object positions around ownership, right? Like, I belong to the land, the land belongs to me. And the ways that people obscure what they mean around that, or invert, you know, invert Indigenous uses like that, and those, you know, those subject and object positions are very much a product of English language structure. You know, they're not necessarily going to exist in any other language. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You could make these arguments for many of our technical terms, of course, which is always fun. You know, a lot of philosophy is perhaps quite untranslatable, but we have a vested interest in pretending otherwise. I think in my prerogative as chair, I'm going to suggest we call it a day there.
You also need to give yourself a vote of thanks.
Yes.
Well, cheers.